The rain fell in relentless, silver sheets, turning the city into a distorted watercolor of bleeding neon and slick, black asphalt. For Elias, the rhythm of the wipers was a hypnotic metronome, counting down the seconds of another Tuesday evening. At 42, he was in the prime of his first life, a respected transition steward with a loving wife, a comfortable home, and a future as predictable and secure as the sunrise. In this world, security was the ultimate currency. The centenary mandate, the unexplained phenomenon that had descended upon humanity some 80 years ago, guaranteed it. No one, through sickness, accident, or malice, could die before their 100th birthday. It was a truth as fundamental as gravity. A truth that had reshaped civilization, turning the frantic, desperate scramble of the before times into a long, measured, and meticulously planned century of existence for every soul born. Elias's job was a testament to this new order. He guided the completing, those reaching the end of their mandated century, through their final days with grace and dignity. He was a ferryman on a river with a known, unchangeable destination. Tonight, however, the river was about to flood its banks. He was thinking of Alara, his wife, and the argument they'd had that morning. It was a gentle argument, as most were in their stable, 20-year life pact, but it simmered beneath the surface. She wanted to finalize their application for a child in the next centenary lottery. He felt a strange, formless hesitation he couldn't articulate. "We have 60 years, Eli," she'd said, her voice laced with that loving, logical patience he usually found so calming. Why the endless pause? The light ahead turned green. He eased his foot onto the accelerator, the electric hum of the vehicle a familiar whisper. The intersection was a torrent of headlights and spray. Then, from the periphery, a flash of defiant red. A sports coupe, driven with a recklessness that was almost archaic, a relic of a time when life was a thing to be risked. It shot through the red light, a crimson missile in the gloom. Tom seemed to stretch, pulling like taffy. Elias's mind, trained in calm, procedural thought, cataloged the impossible. The screech of tires wasn't just a sound. It was a physical tearing of the night's fabric. He saw the other car, a sensible family sedan, enter the intersection, its occupants blissfully unaware. The impact was not a crash. It was an explosion of physics. A brutal, instantaneous punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that should have had 60 more years to run. His own vehicle swerved, its automated collision avoidance system screaming in protest as he wrenched the wheel. He came to a shuddering halt just feet from the mangled chaos. Metal had become a grotesque sculpture of twisted, weeping steel. The sedan was unrecognizable, its front half compressed into a jagged maw. The red coupe was on its side, steam hissing from its fractured engine block like a dying breath. But no one died. Elias knew this. His heart hammered against his ribs not with the fear of death, but with the horror of its absence. He fumbled with his door, the handle cold and slick beneath his trembling fingers. The rain plastered his hair to his scalp as he stumbled out. Sirens were already wailing in the distance, a familiar, non-urgent cry. The emergency containment units, not paramedics, not ambulances in the old sense. Their job was not to save lives, for lives could not be lost. Their job was to manage the aftermath, to contain the unbreakable. Elias approached the sedan first, his professional instincts warring with a primal dread. Through the shattered driver's side window, he saw a man, his head slumped against a deployed airbag stained with something dark. He was groaning, a low, animal sound of pure agony. His arm was bent at an angle that defied anatomy. But he was alive, conscious. In the passenger seat, a woman was weeping, her face a mask of blood, but her eyes were wide with the shock of continued existence. Then he saw the red coupe. The driver's side was crushed inwards, the door folded like a piece of paper. Pinned inside was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her hair, dark and drenched, fanned across the shattered glass of the passenger window. One of her eyes was open, staring blankly into the rain-swept darkness. Her chest was still. It wasn't rising. It wasn't falling. A piece of twisted metal from the car's frame had pierced through the driver's seat, through her torso. It was a wound no human being could survive. Not in the before times. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He had seen thousands of completions. He had held the hands of the elderly as their century expired and their life gently, peacefully faded. He had studied the mandate, its history, its biological impossibilities. He knew the rule. But this was different. This was the rule staring back at him from the abyss. Her body was a ruin. Her heart, by all rights, should have stopped. Her brain, deprived of oxygen, should have ceased its function. She should be dead. He reached out a shaking hand, his fingers hovering near her cheek. It was pale, shockingly cold. There was no pulse in her neck. He knew there wouldn't be. But as he looked closer into that single, vacant eye, he saw it. A flicker, a microscopic, infinitesimal twitch in her pupil. A spark of neurologic activity buried so deep within the wreckage of her body that it was almost undetectable. A ghost of life, chained to a corpse that refused to fall. She wasn't living. She was being kept. The containment units arrived, their movements efficient and somber. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They moved with the quiet reverence of morticians, laying out privacy screens and preparing the hydrogel suspension cradles. One of the officers, a grim-faced man with weary eyes, saw Elias standing there, transfixed. "Sir, you need to step back. This is a containment zone." Elias couldn't finish the sentence. The officer's gaze softened with a familiar, practiced pity. "She's stable, sir. Everyone is always stable. We'll take them to a hushed ward. They'll be cared for." Cared for. The term was a sterile euphemism for a reality so terrifying most people chose not to contemplate it. The hushed wards were the dark secret at the heart of their perfect world, the price of their immortality. Places where the unbreakable were stored, their broken bodies maintained by machines, their consciousnesses trapped in a silent, screaming limbo until their 100th birthday finally, mercifully, released them. Elias backed away, the rain mingling with the cold sweat on his face. He had always known about the wards, in the abstract way one knows about distant wars or historical tragedies. But he had never seen the moment of entry. He had never seen a soul being condemned to one. He looked back at the girl in the red car, a still, pale figure being prepped for a living entombment. That flicker in her eye, it wasn't life. It was a prison sentence just handed down with 75 years left to serve. He had just witnessed a soul being buried alive. As he walked back to his car, his own secure, predictable, century-long life suddenly felt like a cage of terrifying fragility. The quiet argument with Alara about having a child felt grotesquely naive. He had hesitated, and now he knew why. It wasn't a fear of fatherhood. It was a fear of this. A fear of a world that had eliminated death, but had, in its place, created fates far, far worse. The officer's words echoed in his mind. Everyone is always stable. But as he drove away, a new, chilling question began to form, a crack in the very foundation of his world. What if stability was the cruelest punishment of all? The morning after the crash, the world was painfully, unnaturally normal. The sun, a rare visitor in the rainy season, cast long, sharp shadows across the polished chrome and sterile white of the Centenary Tower, where Elias worked. From his office on the 88th floor, the city spread out below, like a perfect, intricate circuit board, every component functioning exactly as designed. It was a city built not for the fleeting passions of a 70-year lifespan, but for the slow, deliberate march of 100 years. Parts were designed to mature over decades. Buildings were constructed with materials that wouldn't degrade for a century, and careers were structured in 25-year blocks known as life quarters. Elias stood before the panoramic window, a cup of synthetic coffee growing cold in his hand. The image of the girl in the red car was burned onto the back of his eyelids. The flicker, that horrifying, resilient spark. He had spent a sleepless night next to Alara, pretending to be at peace while his mind replayed the scene in a relentless loop. Alara, sensing his disquiet but misinterpreting its depth, had simply held his hand. "Bad day on the road," she'd murmured. It's okay. We're safe. Safe. The word felt like a lie. His first appointment of the day was with Anya Sharma, age 99. Her completion day was in 3 weeks. Elias's role as a transition steward was to ensure this final phase was seamless, a positive and reflective culmination of a full life, as the official handbook stated. He smoothed down his uniform, a simple, elegant tunic of gray fabric, and entered the consultation room. The room was designed for tranquility. Soft lighting, minimalist furniture, and a wall that was a live, high-definition projection of a serene forest. Anya was seated in a comfortable chair, a delicate woman with skin like fine parchment, her eyes holding the deep, placid calm of someone who has seen everything twice. Elias, she greeted him, her voice a soft, melodic rustle. Good morning. Good morning, Anya. You're looking well today. It was the standard greeting, but with Anya, it felt true. She was one of the lucky ones, her body and mind still remarkably intact. She was completing her century, not enduring it. The forest is lovely, she said, gesturing to the wall. It reminded me of my first life quarter when I was a biosculptor. We were rewilding the Scottish Highlands then. Did I tell you about that? You did, Elias smiled gently. You designed the lichen patterns on the granite tours. This was the core of his work, the life review. For 90 minutes, they would walk back through her century. Her time as a biosculptor, then her second quarter as a deep-sea cartographer, her third as a linguistics professor specializing in dead languages, and finally, her fourth quarter as a grandmother and community archivist. Her life was a tapestry of experiences so vast it was hard to comprehend. She had married, completed a 50-year life pact, and then entered into a 20-year companionship pact with another partner. She had raised a child who was now 79 years old himself. We've finalized the arrangements for your completion ceremony, Elias said, pulling up a file on his datapad. The grand auditorium is booked. Your life pact partner, Ben, will give the first eulogy, followed by your son, Kale. The music will be from your second quarter, the oceanic soundscapes you helped record. Wonderful, she nodded. It's all so orderly. My own mother, I remember, she died in the before times. It was a cancer. It was messy and sudden and full of rage. She was 58. We never got to say goodbye properly. This, she looked around the serene room, is a kindness. Elias felt a familiar pang of professional pride. This was the purpose of the mandate, the gift it had given humanity. It had replaced the chaos of unpredictable death with the certainty of a managed, dignified end. It had allowed for lives like Anya's, full to the brim. The system worked, but the image of the crash intruded, a discordant note in the symphony. What about the girl? What would her life review be like? 75 years of staring at a white ceiling, listening to the hum of machines, her memories slowly degrading in the silent prison of her own skull. Was that a kindness? Elias? Are you all right? Anya's voice cut through his thoughts. Her old eyes were sharp, perceptive. Yes, of course. Forgive me. He forced a smile, just ensuring all the details are correct. Now, regarding your legacy statement, they continued the session, but a part of Elias remained detached, observing the mechanics of his own world with a new, critical eye. He saw the centenary lottery system, which Alara was so eager to enter, not as a fair method of population control, but as a gamble that brought a new soul into a world with a hidden, terrible price of admission. He saw the life pacts, the 50-year marriage contracts, not as a symbol of enduring love, in which he and Alara were happily ensconced, but as a potential cage for those whose affections might wane after a mere 20 or 30 years. Divorce was legally complex and socially stigmatized. The system was built on the assumption that with enough time, any problem could be solved. But some things, like a broken body or a broken heart, couldn't be fixed. They could only be contained. He saw the entire architecture of their society, an architecture he had always admired for its stability, as a monumental effort to paper over a single, terrifying flaw. The flaw he had witnessed in the rain. After his meeting with Anya, he found himself walking down a different corridor, one that led to the records and containment division. It was a part of the tower he rarely visited. The air here was colder, the lighting more sterile. This was the bureaucracy that underpinned the miracle. He approached a clerk at a data terminal, a young man with a bored expression. "I need to follow up on the disposition of individuals from a vehicular incident last night," Elias said, keeping his voice level and professional. "Intersection of the Northern Arc and the Third Conduit." The clerk typed, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. "Incident 7B, 441. 3 individuals processed. 2 admitted to Regional Ward 7 for corporeal reconstruction and observation. 1 admitted to the hush." The hush. The colloquial, chilling term for a long-term hushed ward. Elias's stomach tightened. "The 3rd individual," Elias pressed, his voice dropping slightly. "A young woman, driver of the red coupe. I was a primary witness. I need to confirm her identity for my report. It was a lie, but a plausible one." The clerk's eyes narrowed. "Steward, you know that information is sealed. Containment protocols are absolute. Once an individual is admitted to the hush, their public file is closed. It's for the family's peace. It's for the public's peace." "I understand the protocol," Elias insisted, a new, unfamiliar stubbornness taking root in him. "But my witness statement requires a name. It's a simple procedural request." The clerk sighed, a gust of annoyance. He clearly didn't want the hassle, but Elias's title as a steward carried some weight. He typed a few more commands, then glanced at his screen. "Lena." Her name was Lena, age 26. "That's all you get. The file is now locked to your clearance level. Don't ask again." Lena. The name was a simple, beautiful thing. It felt heavy in his mind, a piece of lead. It gave the horror a human face. Lena, 26. 74 years left to serve in silence and darkness. Elias thanked the clerk and walked away, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He had the name, but having it didn't bring closure. It brought a terrible, burgeoning sense of responsibility. He was a transition steward. He helped people find a peaceful end. But what about those who were denied one? What about those for whom the end was a destination they could see, but could not reach for lifetime upon lifetime? He returned to his perfect office, with its perfect view of the perfect city. But nothing was perfect anymore. The system wasn't a kindness. It was a compromise. A terrible, Faustian bargain they had all accepted without ever reading the fine print. And as he stared out at the sprawling metropolis, a city of 1 billion people all marching toward their 100th year, he couldn't shake a single, haunting question. If the price of a guaranteed long life is the possibility of a living death, had humanity truly made a good deal? The walls of Elias and Alara's apartment were a testament to their shared history, a curated gallery of a placid, well-lived life. A holographic image of them on their packed day, 20 years ago, young and beaming with the certainty of a guaranteed half-century together. A shimmering, kinetic sculpture they had bought on their 10th anniversary trip to the lunar colonies. A framed certificate of Alara's mastery in neural architecture, her second-quarter career. Their home was an echo chamber of contentment. But tonight, for Elias, the echoes sounded hollow. He stood in the kitchen, ostensibly preparing their evening meal, but his hands were still. He was staring at the nutrient printer as it meticulously constructed a block of protein paste, his mind miles away in the cold, sterile corridors of the hush. Lena. The name was a phantom limb, an ache for something he hadn't even lost. Alara entered, her presence filling the room with a warmth that usually enveloped him. Tonight, it felt like a heat lamp, artificial and intrusive. She came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her chin on his shoulder. "You're quiet tonight," she murmured, her lips brushing his ear. "Still thinking about the crash?" "It was visceral," he said, the understatement of the century. "They're in the best place for them now," she said, her voice full of the unshakable faith in the system that he once shared. "The reconstruction technology is incredible. In a few years, they'll be back in their lives, good as new." "Not all of them," he said, the words slipping out, sharper than he intended. "One of them went to the hush." Alara stiffened slightly. The hush was a topic polite society avoided. It was the skeleton in their collective closet, the monster under their shared bed. It was the necessary evil that made their world possible, and like all such things, it was best left unexamined. "Oh," she said, her voice losing some of its warmth. "Well, that's tragic, but it's rare, Eli. Statistically insignificant." "Was it insignificant for her?" he countered, turning to face her. "Her name is Lena. She's 26 years old." Alara's brow furrowed, a delicate line of concern between her eyes. "How do you know her name?" "Eli, you're not supposed to." "I looked it up," he admitted, his gaze unwavering. "I had to." "What?" The question was genuine, laced with a confusion that bordered on hurt. "Why would you seek out something so morbid? Our life is good. We are safe. We are planning a family. Why are you digging into the one dark corner of the world we're all supposed to leave alone?" This was the chasm that had opened between them. For Alara, the mandate was a promise of security, a warm blanket against the cold anxieties of the before times. Her parents had been born just after the shift, and they had raised her on stories of the old world, the frantic terror of disease, the random cruelty of accidents, the grief that could strike at any moment. For her, a world without premature death was a paradise, and the hushed wards were a tiny, justifiable price to pay for it. For Elias, that price had suddenly become unthinkable. His own inner conflict, once a formless anxiety, was now crystallizing into a sharp, painful dilemma. His dream had always been the same as Alara's, a long, meaningful life, filled with love, learning, and the joy of raising a child in a world free from the greatest of fears. He had loved the order, the predictability. He loved Alara and the sanctuary of their pact. But his deepest fear was not chaos or uncertainty. It was meaninglessness. And what he had seen in Lena's, it was the embodiment of a meaningless existence. A biological function devoid of spirit, a body without a soul. He looked at Alara, at her beautiful, rational face, and for the first time, he was terrified. Not for himself, but for her, for the child they might have. What if the lottery of fate, which no longer dealt in death, dealt them a broken life instead? What if he had to watch Alara, or his own son or daughter, being wheeled into the hush, condemned to decades of silent suffering? The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. "I'm a transition steward, Alara," he said, his voice low and intense. "My entire life is about ensuring a dignified end. But I stood on that roadside, and I watched a young woman be sentenced to the most undignified existence imaginable. And we're supposed to call it care? We're supposed to turn away and talk about how statistically insignificant it is? I can't. I don't think I can." Alara pulled away from him, her arms crossed over her chest. It was a defensive posture he rarely saw. "What are you saying? That the mandate is a mistake? That you'd rather go back to the before times? You'd rather our child could be taken from us by a fever? Or that a car crash would leave you a widow at 45? No, of course not. But there has to be a better way. There has to be mercy." "Mercy," she scoffed, the words sounding alien on her tongue. "The mandate is mercy. It's the ultimate mercy. It's the gift of a full life, guaranteed." "What are you talking about? It sounds like you wish that girl had died." The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy and poisonous. He couldn't deny it. In that horrific moment, seeing the metal piercing her chest, his first thought, the pre-mandate, instinctual thought, was, she's gone. May she rest in peace. The horror came from the realization that she wasn't, and she couldn't. "I wish she didn't have to suffer," he said finally, the words feeling weak and inadequate. "And the best minds of our generation are working on that." Alara's voice rose, her frustration spilling over. "Neural bridging, synthetic consciousness, corporeal regeneration. We're solving the problem. It just takes time. We have time. That's the whole point." She was right, of course. The official narrative was one of progress. The problem of the hush was being addressed. But it had been 80 years since the shift. 80 years of progress, and the hushed wards were still full, still being filled. He saw the pain and confusion in her eyes. He was frightening her. He was questioning the very bedrock of their reality, the foundation upon which they had built their love, their home, their future. To her, He was flirting with a dangerous, nihilistic heresy. To him, he was just beginning to open his eyes. He wanted to pull her close, to tell her everything was fine, to go back to being the man he was 2 days ago. The man who could have this conversation and take her side, who could agree that it was tragic but necessary, and then turn his attention back to their lottery application. But he couldn't. The flicker in Lena's eye had started a fire in him, and he didn't know how to put it out. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not knowing what else to say. "I'm just trying to understand." Alara's expression softened, but the distance remained. "Then understand this, Eli. We have a good life. A perfect life. Don't break it by staring into an abyss that has nothing to do with us." She turned and left the kitchen, the nutrient paste sitting untouched on the counter between them. The silence she left behind was louder than their argument. Elias was alone with his thoughts, the chasm between him and his wife now terrifyingly real. He had always believed their pact was a bond of shared minds and hearts. But he was now on a path she could not, or would not, walk with him. He feared the abyss Alara spoke of, but he also feared what would happen if he turned away from it. To ignore Lena's fate now would be to betray a part of himself he was only just discovering. It would be to accept the beautiful, comfortable lie, and he wasn't sure he could live another 60 years doing that. His gaze fell upon the holographic image of their pact day. Two bright-eyed, young people promising each other a lifetime of shared truths. But what happens to a promise when one person's truth fundamentally, terrifyingly, changes? The days that followed were a study in dissonance. On the surface, Elias's life continued its placid rhythm. He and Alara spoke in careful, gentle tones, orbiting the raw crater of their disagreement like wary astronauts. They discussed their work, the news, the weather, anything but the hush. At the Centenary Tower, he performed his duties with impeccable professionalism, guiding his elderly charges toward their completions with a calm he did not feel. He was a man split in two, the compliant steward and the silent heretic. The heretic was winning. The thought of Lena, alone in the perpetual twilight of the hush, was a constant, low-grade fever in his mind. The system was designed to make people like her invisible, to file them away under tragic necessity and lock the door. But Elias had a key. Not a physical key, but one forged from his position, his knowledge of the bureaucracy, and a newfound willingness to bend the rules he had spent his life upholding. His first trial was one of information. He needed to know where she was. Not just the hush, but which one. There were dozens of such facilities scattered in remote, discreet locations. Regional Ward 7, the clerk had said, but that was a vast complex. His clearance level was a wall. He needed a way over it. His thoughts turned to Julian. Old man Julian wasn't just a former colleague. He was a living relic. At 98, he was one of the few people Elias knew who had clear, adult memories of the before times. He had been a doctor then, a cardiologist, before the shift had made his specialty largely obsolete. He'd transitioned, like everyone, becoming a philosopher and historian of the mandate, and had served as a mentor to a generation of stewards, including Elias. Now retired, he lived in the city's historic quarter, a place of brick and wood that defied the modern aesthetic. Elias found him in his library, a room that smelled of old paper and dust, a scent almost extinct in their sanitized world. Julian was hunched over a physical book, a rare artifact, his face illuminated by a warm, yellow lamp. "Elias," Julian said, looking up over his spectacles without surprise, as if he'd been expecting him. "You have the look of a man who has touched a live wire and is still feeling the shock." "I saw something, Julian," Elias began, the words tumbling out. He recounted the crash, the girl, the flicker in her eye, his visit to the records department. He told him everything, the clinical horror of the scene and the existential dread that followed. Julian listened patiently, his ancient eyes never leaving Elias's face. When Elias finished, the old man leaned back, his chair creaking a protest. "You have seen the flaw in the diamond," Julian said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Most people spend their century admiring the sparkle, content to ignore the imperfection that gives the stone its tension. You decided to put your eye to the loop. They call it the hush, Elias said, his voice tight, as if it's a secret to be kept, a place to put the inconvenient. I need to know what happens in there. I need to know where she is. Julian sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of his near century. What you are asking is dangerous, my boy, not just to your career, but to your peace of mind. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The architecture of our forever, as you call it, is built on a foundation of willful ignorance. To challenge it is to risk bringing the whole structure down on your head. I don't care about the structure anymore, Elias said, with a conviction that surprised himself. I care about the people trapped in the basement. Her name is Lena. A flicker of something, respect, perhaps, or sadness, crossed Julian's face. He rose slowly and walked to a heavy, locked cabinet of dark wood. He produced an old-fashioned metal key and opened it. Inside were not books, but rows of antiquated data chips. The system is not as monolithic as it seems, Julian said, searching through the chips. It has ghosts, backdoors. I was part of the team that designed the initial containment protocols back when the shift was new and we were all terrified. We built in diagnostic overrides, ways for auditors to get in discreetly to make sure the facilities were being run humanely. He chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. Humanely. A fine word. We had such ideals. He pulled out a small, silver chip. This is an auditor's key. It's 80 years old, a relic of a system that has been patched and updated 1,000 times. But the core architecture, the foundations, they rarely change those. This should still grant you Tier 4 access. Enough to see the patient roster and location for any ward in this region. He held it out to Elias. But it will leave a trace. A ghost in the machine. If someone looks for it, they will find an unauthorized access linked to the terminal you use. They will find you. Elias took the chip. It was cool and smooth in his palm. It felt like a weapon. What will they do? In the old days, they'd have you fired. Today, who knows? They might send you for psychological rebalancing. They might decide you're a threat to social stability. A life of quiet observation in a comfortable apartment is a privilege, Elias, not a right. They can take it away. The threat was real. His career, his home with Alara, his carefully constructed life, it was all on the line. He thought of Alara's warning. Don't break it by staring into an abyss. But Julian's words echoed louder. You have seen the flaw in the diamond. That night, Elias waited until Alara was asleep. The silence of the apartment was absolute. He slipped out of bed and went to his personal terminal in his study. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was more than breaking a rule. It was a betrayal of the world that had nurtured him, the world Alara cherished. He inserted Julian's chip. The screen flickered, and a simple, text-based interface appeared over the usual glossy operating system. It was ancient, a digital fossil. A single line blinked. Enter audit query. With trembling fingers, he typed, Search, Lena. Incident 7B, 441. The system processed for a moment. Then, a line of text appeared, stark and chilling in its simplicity. Lena Rojas, age 26. Admitted, Ward 7 Delta. The hush. Status, permanent containment. Prognosis, not applicable. Completion date, year 134, day 211. Ward 7 Delta. It had a location. A remote facility in the Northern Highlands, nestled in a valley that was perpetually shrouded in fog. An old military bunker from before the Unification Wars, repurposed. A tomb. He had the information. He had crossed the line. But the information wasn't an end. It was a beginning. A map to the heart of the abyss. He could see the path forward now, a dark, treacherous road leading to a place the world had tried to erase. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified and exhilarated him, that he was going to walk it. He removed the chip, and the screen returned to normal, showing a serene image of a nebula. It looked unchanged, but Elias knew it was a lie. A ghost of his intrusion now lingered in the system's memory, a silent witness to his first true act of rebellion. He returned to bed, sliding in beside Alara. Her breathing was even and peaceful. She was dreaming of their future, of their child, of the long, happy decades stretching before them. He was now the keeper of a secret that could shatter that dream. He had faced his first trial and had not backed down. But his victory felt cold and hollow. He had found the name of the abyss, Ward 7 Delta. Now, what would he do with it? Could a man like him, a simple steward, really challenge the silent, crushing weight of a perfect system? The drive to Ward 7 Delta was a pilgrimage into purgatory. Elias had told Alara he was attending a multi-day steward conference in the Northern Territories, a lie that felt like a shard of glass in his mouth. The look of relief on her face, that he was re-engaging with his career, moving past his morbid fixation, was more painful than any argument. The further his vehicle sped from the gleaming spires of the city, the more the landscape seemed to decay, shifting from manicured ecumenopolis to rugged, untamed wilderness. The fog, just as the records described, began to gather in the valleys, a great, gray sea that swallowed the road ahead. Ward 7 Delta was not marked. There were no signs, only a single, unmarked service road branching off the main conduit, leading into the heart of the fog. The facility itself was a brutalist horror of concrete and steel, half buried in the mountainside. It radiated a profound and unsettling silence, the kind found in deep tombs. There were no windows, no signs of life, just a single, reinforced gate and a series of emotionless scanner arrays. Getting in was the next impossibility. Julian's auditor's key could get him data, but it couldn't open a physical door. For that, Elias had to rely on the oldest trick in the book, deceit wrapped in the cloak of authority. He parked, approached the intercom, and presented his steward identification. "Transition Steward Elias Thorne," he announced, his voice betraying a tremor he couldn't control. "I'm here for a pre-completion consultation. The patient is Lena Rojas." There was a long silence. The lie was audacious. Pre-completion consultations were for the lucid, the elderly, those like Anya Sharma. To request one for a resident of the hush was absurd. He was banking on the sheer unexpectedness of it and the deeply ingrained deference to his title. "Stand by," a metallic voice crackled. The wait was agonizing. He imagined alarms blaring, security teams swarming. But then, with a deep groan of tortured metal, the gate began to slide open. The system was so rigid, so unused to being challenged, that his absurd request had been processed as legitimate. No one would be audacious enough to lie about this. He was an anomaly the system couldn't compute. He was met inside by a man in a simple orderly's uniform. His face was a pallid mask of profound exhaustion, his eyes hollowed out, as if he'd seen too much for too long. He didn't question Elias's presence, merely gestured for him to follow. "This way, steward," the orderly said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We don't get many visitors." They walked through corridors of polished concrete, the only sound the soft hum of life support and the whisper of air circulation. The air was cold, sterile, and smelled faintly of ozone and antiseptic. It was the smell of preserved flesh. This wasn't a hospital. A hospital was a place of hope, of healing. This was a museum of broken things, where the exhibits were kept breathing. They passed thick glass windows looking into refrigerated rooms. Elias forced himself to look. Inside each room was a person, or what was left of one, a man, his body charred beyond recognition from a fire, suspended in a nutrient gel, a web of tubes and wires his only connection to the world. A woman, her limbs twisted and shattered from a fall, her face frozen in a silent scream. An old man, his body ravaged by a pre-mandate cancer that had been reactivated in his 90s, the tumors grown to grotesque proportions, yet his heart stubbornly refused to stop. They were all there, conscious in some form or another. Trapped, waiting, some for a few years, some for 90. Elias felt his stomach churn. This was the cost. This was the fine print of the centenary mandate. The images would be seared into his memory forever. "She's in the deep ward," the orderly said, his voice as empty as the corridor. "The permanents." They arrived at a heavy, sealed door marked Delta. The orderly swiped a card, and it hissed open, revealing a room that was darker, colder. And in the center of it, alone, was a single hydrogel suspension cradle. It was Lena. He barely recognized her. The vibrant young woman from the driver's seat was gone. What remained was a pale, skeletal figure floating in the translucent, shimmering gel. Her head had been shaved, a network of wires and microsensors adhering to her scalp. Her body was a roadmap of surgical scars, a testament to the futile attempts to piece her back together. The wound in her chest was gone, sealed by synthetic skin, but the damage was internal, absolute. Her eyes were closed. She looked like a specimen in a jar. The neural activity is minimal, the orderly stated, gesturing to a monitor displaying a series of jagged, erratic lines. Mostly deep brainstem function. The cortex is quiet. We think. We can't be sure. The technology to read their thoughts is theoretical. For all we know, she's dreaming. Or screaming. Elias stepped closer, his hand resting on the cold glass of the cradle. He could feel a faint vibration, the thrum of the machines that were her heart, her lungs, her life. He looked at her face, so still and serene, a horrifying parody of peace. 74 years. 74 years of this. Why? Elias whispered, the question directed at the orderly, at the room, at the universe. Why do we do this? The orderly looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than exhaustion appeared in his eyes. It was a dark, bitter cynicism. Because we're cowards, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Because we're more afraid of the idea of death than we are of the reality of suffering. We call a miracle a gift, but it's a curse, a biological prison, and we're the wardens. The orderly then leaned closer, his next words changing everything for Elias. But there are stories, he whispered, his eyes darting toward the corridor. Rumors. Among the staff in places like this. They say there are people, a group, who don't believe in this curse. They believe in the old ways. In mercy, Elias's blood ran cold. Mercy? What do you mean? They call it the release. The orderly breathed, the words themselves seeming like a heresy. An act of true compassion. A way to bypass the mandate. To let these poor souls go. It's a myth, of course. A fairy tale we tell ourselves on the long nights. To perform a release, it would be the greatest crime imaginable. To willfully end a life before 100, they'd lock you up and throw away the key for the rest of your century. The release. The concept hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. It was impossible, and yet it made perfect sense. In a world where death had been outlawed, the only true act of rebellion, the only true act of mercy for the damned, would be to restore it. Is it real? Elias asked, his voice barely audible. The orderly just looked at him, a strange, desperate hope warring with his ingrained cynicism. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. In his silence, Elias found his answer. The myth was real. There was a secret, hidden even deeper than the hush, a truth so profound it could shatter their world. The power to grant death was still in human hands. He looked back at Lena, floating in her timeless prison. He was no longer just a witness to her tragedy. He was now the bearer of a terrible, secret hope. A hope that might be the only thing that could save her, but one that would force him to commit the ultimate sin. He left Ward 7 Delta with the orderly's hushed words echoing in his soul. The world he had returned to, the world of sun and commerce and long life, now seemed like a fragile, beautiful lie constructed on a foundation of unimaginable cruelty. And hidden within that lie was a secret, a group of people who held the power to grant the one thing this world had tried to abolish. He had found the abyss. Now, he had discovered that there were people who dared to build a bridge across it. The question that now consumed him was no longer just about Lena. It was about himself. Did he have the courage to find that bridge, and perhaps to help someone cross it? Guilt was a poor house guest. It sat with Elias at the dinner table. It lay beside him in bed, and it stared back at him from his own reflection. He had seen the truth of the hush, and the knowledge had isolated him completely. He moved through his life like a ghost, his conversations with Alara becoming more stilted, his smiles more brittle. The secret of the release was a burning coal in his heart, a dangerous, seductive idea that consumed his waking thoughts. He began researching, diving into encrypted forums and historical archives from the early days of the shift, searching for whispers, for any trace of the myth the orderly had shared. Alara was not blind. She saw the change in him. The man she had made a 50-year pact with was disappearing, replaced by a brooding, distant stranger. The final thread of their carefully woven life snapped on a Sunday afternoon, an afternoon that should have been filled with the lazy comfort of shared companionship. She found him in his study, not relaxing or reading, but hunched over his terminal, scrolling through what looked like medical schematics and blueprints of old, decommissioned facilities. His face was pale, illuminated by the screen's glow, his expression one of obsessive intensity. "Eli, what is this?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. She had entered so silently he hadn't noticed. He blanked the screen instantly, a gesture of guilt so transparent it was almost comical. "Nothing, Alara. Just some research for work." "Research?" She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the room, noticing the books he'd brought back from Julian's. Old medical ethics textbooks, philosophical treatises on suffering. "This doesn't look like work. This looks like the obsession you promised you'd let go of. I thought you went to a conference. I thought you were moving on." He had no more lies left. The exhaustion of his deceit was overwhelming. "I didn't go to a conference. I went to Ward 7 Delta. I saw her, Alara. I saw Lena." The name fell between them like a stone. Alara physically recoiled, as if he had confessed to a crime. "You went there? You lied to me? To stand in that place and stare at that poor girl. For what, Elias? To satisfy some dark curiosity." "It wasn't curiosity," he shot back, his voice rising with a passion she hadn't heard in years. "It was a duty, to see what we were doing, what our perfect, stable world is built on. You talk about it as a place, Alara. It's not a place. It's a living tomb. We are burying people alive and calling it humane." "And what would you have us do?" she cried, her own voice cracking with a mixture of fear and anger. "Let them die? Undo the mandate? Would you have preferred I had to bury my own father when he had his heart failure at 60? The mandate saved him. It gave him 40 more years. It gave me my father. That is what it's for. And I am grateful for that," he yelled, standing up, the space between them charged with the static of irreconcilable beliefs. But what if his heart had been saved, but the rest of his body was crushed? What if he was left a prisoner in his own skull for 4 decades? Would you still call that a gift? The question struck her, and for a moment he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But it was quickly extinguished, replaced by a hardened, desperate loyalty to the world she knew. "That is the price, Elias. It's a terrible price for a very, very few. But it is the price for all of us to live without the daily terror of loss. You, a transition steward, should understand that better than anyone. Your job is to celebrate the full century, not to mourn the struggle to get there." "My job," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "is about dignity. And there is no dignity in Ward 7 Delta. There's only sustained agony. But I found something else out, Alara. There's a rumor, a way to help them, a way to grant mercy." He saw the realization dawn on her face, the horror of what he was implying. "Mercy? You mean killing them?" The words were a choked whisper. "Eli, no. That's monstrous. It's the ultimate crime. You're talking about murder." "No," he roared, the word tearing from his soul. "I'm talking about compassion. I'm talking about the release, about ending a suffering that we have no right to prolong." He had said it. He had given the myth a name, brought it out of the shadows and into the sacred space of their home, their pact. And in doing so, he had shattered it. Alara stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. The man she loved, the calm, rational, gentle man she had built a life with, was talking about committing an act so fundamentally opposed to their entire civilization that it was almost unthinkable. He wasn't just questioning the system anymore. He was planning to wage war on it. I don't know who you are anymore, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The man I made a pact with he would never even think this. You're radicalized. You're sick. You need help. I'm not sick, Alara. I'm awake. No, she said, shaking her head, a terrible, cold resolve hardening her features. You're a danger. To yourself and to this family. To the future we were supposed to have. She took a step back, her hand reaching for the personal comm link on her wrist. If you won't get help, Eli, I'll have to get it for you. I will not let you throw our life away. I will not let you become a monster. The betrayal was absolute. It was not born of malice, but of love, a twisted, terrified love that saw his quest for mercy as a descent into madness. She was going to report him. To save him, she was going to have him arrested, rebalanced, his mind wiped clean of this dangerous compassion. She would rather have a placid, empty version of him than the passionate, rebellious man he was becoming. He looked at her, at the woman who was his everything, her finger hovering over the button that would condemn him. In her eyes, he saw the full power of the system they lived in. A system so pervasive, so successful, that it had convinced the people it ruled to become its most fervent protectors, even against those they loved. He had thought the crisis would be an external one, a battle against a faceless bureaucracy. He had never imagined the true crisis would be this. A choice between the woman he loved and the soul he was trying to save. Alara, don't, he pleaded, his voice breaking, but her eyes were filled with a righteous, terrified certainty. She was saving him from himself. She was protecting their pact. She was doing the right thing. The crisis was no longer a distant threat. It was here, in his home, in the eyes of his wife. He had seconds to act, to run, to abandon everything he had ever known, or to let her make that call, and let the perfect world he now despised swallow him whole. The world dissolved in that single, horrifying moment. Alara's finger on the comm link was a trigger, and his life, as he knew it, was the target. There was no time for persuasion, no space for reason. There was only flight. He didn't run. He simply walked past her, out of the study, out of the apartment, and out of the life they had built together. He didn't look back. The click of the door, closing behind him, was the sound of the guillotine. He was a fugitive now, not just from the law, but from his own past. For weeks, he lived in the city's underbelly, a world he never knew existed. He slept in automated transit pods, ate nutrient paste from street corner vendors, and used public terminals to continue his search, always looking over his shoulder. He was now officially a person of concern, his face and biosignature flagged in the system. His funds were frozen, his identity erased. He was a ghost. His only lifeline was Julian. He contacted the old man through an encrypted channel, a relic from the before times that Julian still maintained. They met in a forgotten corner of a sub-level maintenance tunnel, the air thick with the smell of damp metal and ionized air. She did it, then, Julian said, his voice heavy with sorrow. She chose the system over you. She thought she was saving me, Elias replied, his voice hoarse. The pain of the betrayal was a physical weight, a constant pressure behind his sternum. It often begins that way, Julian sighed. Love is the most powerful tool of compliance. But you are here. You did not surrender. What is it you want from an old man, Elias? The release, Elias said, the words now his only creed. The orderly at the ward was right. It's real. I need to find them. Not for me. For Lena. Julian studied him for a long moment, his ancient eyes seeming to peer directly into Elias's soul, weighing his resolve, his motivation. He was looking for fanaticism, for revenge, for personal despair. Elias held his gaze, offering only the quiet, desperate sincerity of his purpose. Finally, Julian nodded. They exist. They're not a myth. They call themselves the anamnesis, from the Greek word for remembrance. They believe our world has forgotten a fundamental truth about what it means to be human, that a life without end is a life without shape, and that mercy is a greater virtue than endurance. Julian gave him a location, a small, unassuming antiquarian bookshop in a quiet district. He gave him a phrase to say, I am looking for a first edition of On Dignity. It was a code. Finding the anamnesis was like stepping into another reality. The bookshop was run by a woman named Kara, her face kind but her eyes sharp with the same cautious intelligence as Julian's. After he spoke the phrase, she led him not to a bookshelf, but to a hidden door behind a tapestry. The people he met there were not the wild-eyed fanatics he might have imagined. They were doctors, nurses, philosophers, former priests, and people like him, ordinary citizens who had witnessed the cruelty of the mandate firsthand and could no longer abide it. Their leader was a former neuroscientist named Ben, a calm, thoughtful man in his 70s whose own partner had spent a decade in the hush before her completion. "We are not murderers, Elias," Ben explained in their first meeting, his voice gentle but firm. "We are, in our own way, transition stewards, like you were. But we serve those the world has forgotten. We offer an end to a journey that has become an unbearable torture. We offer a choice that has been stolen." They vetted him for weeks. They tested his resolve, questioned his motives. Was this about his own guilt over witnessing the crash? Was it a rebellion against his wife? They had to be sure his purpose was pure. To perform a release is to take on a burden that never leaves you, Ben told him. You must be certain you are doing it for the one you are helping and not for yourself. Elias looked inward, confronting the dark corners of his own heart. He had lost everything: his wife, his home, his career, his identity. It would be easy to see this as an act of vengeance against the system that had taken it all. But when he closed his eyes, he did not see Alara's face or the cold walls of his empty apartment. He saw Lena, floating in the gel, a silent monument to suffering. He was doing it for her, for the flicker of life, trapped in a ruined vessel. He passed their tests. They agreed to help. The plan was terrifyingly simple. They had an inside contact at Ward 7 Delta, the same orderly Elias had met. He would disable the internal surveillance for a window of 3 minutes. Using a forged medical transfer order, Elias, disguised as an orderly himself, would be granted access to Lena's room. The device for the release was not a weapon. It was a small, sophisticated neurodisruptor designed to send a targeted, chaotic signal into the brainstem. It didn't destroy tissue. It simply stopped the spark. It interrupted the fail-safe signal of the Centenary Mandate, allowing the body to finally, naturally, shut down. It was designed to be instantaneous and painless, a quiet stopping of a machine that should have stopped long ago. The moment of choice arrived on a storm-swept night, much like the one when it all began. Back in the cold, silent corridors of Ward 7 Delta, Elias stood once more before Lena's suspension cradle. The orderly gave him a final, haunted look and slipped away. The red light on the security camera blinked off. 3 minutes. His heart hammered. This was it. The culmination of his rebellion, his grief, his entire new existence. He held the disruptor in his hand. It was small, heavy, and cold. It was the weight of a human soul. He looked at Lena's face. The monitors beside her cradle displayed her vital signs: the artificial heartbeat, the forced respiration, the minimal, jagged lines of her brain activity. 74 more years of this. Nearly a lifetime of non-existence. He thought of Alara, and a wave of profound sadness washed over him. He thought of the life they had lost, the simple happiness he had traded for this terrible purpose. He thought of Anya Sharma and her peaceful, dignified end. A full life completed. Lena had been denied a full life. The least she deserved was a dignified end. This was not murder. It was not a crime. It was the most profound act of empathy he could imagine. It was giving her the one thing the world had forbidden: peace. He reached out his other hand and placed it on the glass, directly over her still heart. "Lena," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's Elias. I was there, at the crash. I'm so sorry. This is not for me. This is for you. May you rest." His thumb hovered over the activation stud on the disruptor. This was the final, irreversible step. To press, it was to break the most fundamental law of his world. To not press it was to condemn her to a fate worse than any death. He had to choose between the world's law and a human being's dignity. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and made his choice. He pressed the button. There was no sound, no flash of light. The neurodisruptor emitted a silent pulse, imperceptible to anyone but the machines tethered to Lena's existence. For a single, eternal second, nothing happened. The jagged lines on the monitor continued their frantic, meaningless dance. The artificial heart kept its steady, synthetic rhythm. Elias's own heart stopped. Had it failed? Was it all a lie, a hopeless myth? And then it happened. The line measuring her brainstem activity, the one that held the stubborn spark of the mandate, wavered. It flickered once, twice like a dying candle, and then it went flat. A perfect horizontal green line. One by one, the other monitors followed suit. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor slowed, faltered, and then stretched into a single, unending tone. The respiration graph smoothed into a placid lake. The machines, sensing the absence of the life they were programmed to sustain, fell silent. The low hum that had filled the room, the sound of Lena's forced existence, ceased. It was replaced by a silence so profound, so absolute, it felt sacred. Elias stood in that holy silence, his hands still on the cold glass, tears streaming down his face. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a strange, wrenching relief. He had not taken a life. He had given a death. He had restored a fundamental human right. The red light on the camera blinked back on. His time was up. He slipped the disruptor into his pocket and walked out of the room, not looking back. He nodded to the orderly in the corridor, a silent exchange of immense, shared gravity. He was caught, of course. Not then, not there. But weeks later, the spontaneous system failure of a hush patient was an unprecedented event. An investigation was launched, a deep, forensic audit of the facility's logs. They found the disabled camera. They found the forged transfer order. And they found the ghost of his unauthorized access from months before. They found Julian. They found the anamnesis. They found him. The trial was the greatest public spectacle of the century. It was not held in a courtroom, but broadcast to the entire world. The prosecution painted him as a monster, a terrorist who had attacked the very foundation of their society, the sacred gift of a full life. They called him the Mercy Killer, a name that dripped with revulsion. Alara was there. She testified against him, her voice trembling but resolute. She spoke of his obsession, his radicalization, his rejection of the perfect life they had. She wept, not for him, but for the man he used to be. He saw in her eyes not hatred, but a deep, uncomprehending grief. She had loved a man who no longer existed. When it was his turn to speak, Elias did not offer a defense. He did not plead for leniency. He simply told his story. He spoke of the crash, of the flicker in Lena's eye. He described in stark, unflinching detail the horrors of the hushed ward. And then he asked the world a question. "We have congratulated ourselves for a century on conquering death," he said, his voice calm and clear, echoing in billions of homes. "But in our fear of endings, we have created a world that is terrified of mercy. We have built a paradise on a foundation of hidden torture chambers. We celebrate the length of a life, but we have forgotten to ask about its shape. What is the value of a breath without thought? What is the dignity of a heartbeat without hope? What is the meaning of a life without the possibility of a peaceful end?" He looked directly into the camera, speaking not to the judges, but to every person watching. "I did not kill Lena Rojas. I released her. I gave her what our mandate, in its infinite, cruel wisdom, had denied her, a conclusion, an end to suffering. If that is the greatest crime in our world, then our world is more broken than I could have ever imagined. The question is not whether I am guilty. The question is whether we are." His speech did not change the law. The system was too entrenched, the fear of death too profound. He was found guilty. The sentence was the only one possible for such a crime: permanent containment until his own completion day. He would spend the next 58 years in a cell, a living monument to his heresy. The final scene of the story is not in a courtroom, but 20 years later. Elias, now in his 60s, sits in a small, white room. His prison. It has a bed, a desk, and a single, barred window that looks out onto a patch of sky. He is older, his face lined with the years, but his eyes are clear and calm. He has spent 2 decades in solitude, but he is not a broken man. He is a man at peace. His actions did not start a revolution, but they had started a conversation. The term release had entered the public lexicon. Underground philosophical societies, inspired by the anamnesis, had sprung up. The number of people entering the centenary lottery had dropped for the first time in its history. A seed of doubt had been planted. People had begun to question the perfection of their world. Elias receives a single, encrypted message once a year. It's from Julian's successors. They tell him of a young man who chose not to undergo a risky surgery that might leave him in the hush, of a family who successfully lobbied to have their brain-dead 90-year-old father's life support discontinued, citing Elias's trial. The cracks in the diamond were beginning to show. He looks out his window at the blue, endless sky. He has lost his wife, his freedom, his place in the world. But in that cold room in Ward 7 Delta, he had found something he never knew he was missing: his own humanity. He had learned that a true life is not measured by its length, but by its meaning, by the compassion we show, and by the dignity we are afforded in its final, sacred moments. He closes his eyes. He does not fear the 38 years he has left in this cell. He does not fear his own completion day. He has learned the ultimate lesson of a world without death, that the most important thing is not how long you live, but how you choose to define what it means to be alive. And in the quiet of his cell, Elias Thorne is, for the first time, truly and completely free.